Hey, everybody. Soccer Dad Pod time. As usual, rolling in with a tune. I played this one before because it's usually apropos on some of our guests, and today's conversation is right in the heart of it. Playing a little Heroes, David Bowie, because I have a feeling today we're going to be name dropping, a number of people that are legitimately heroes to so many of us that love this game over the decades/generations. I want to start off with, and I'm solo today. Those two, as you well know, they have day jobs. I have different kind of jobs. So guest today was out on the West Coast. We had to make something work in the daytime. So it's me. I want to thank everybody for listening. I'm a numbers guy, and the numbers keep going up, and I only have you to thank for that. If you don't mind, I've asked time and time again. It's free, it's cheap, it's easy. A little review, especially those reviews. Those are huge. And if you're a soccer mom or dad just kind of sitting in carpool trying to navigate this chaos that is soccer parent lifestyle, send it to another parent. You know who I'm talking about too. It's that parent that's sitting in their chair. They got way too many bags. They got way too many stuff. They're yelling at the ref, all that other stuff. Say, hey, I got something for you here. A little cheaper than a therapist. Only takes an hour of your day every now and then. Give it a share. So, Soccer Dad Pod. Let's see here. I got to take a quick look at one thing because it's been a little crazy lately. We've been on a roll. The last episode that we are putting out at the time of this recording, we were talking to the crew at PCDA, Pre-College Development Academy. Was a super interesting episode because in the landscape that is college soccer and, everybody trying to figure out how to get their kids somewhere, how to get scholarship money, how to do X, Y, Z, move them to the next level. And the conversation around gap year is really starting to accelerate. Especially in the context of if you have a 17 or an 18-year-old young high school grad wanting to go play college soccer, they're facing a lineup that can be populated with 22, 23, 24-year-old foreigners as well as domestic players. And the reality is there's a difference physically, mentally, etc. Gap years are starting to come into play, and PCDA is an organization out of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, just south of Nashville. They're creating a potential solution for those that are like, you know what, I'm not quite ready. I didn't really get the school that I want. I would like to continue to develop. I want to make sure and get some credits. I don't want to burn my eligibility. Well, go take a listen to that one. They kind of piece it together. Really interesting concept that I'm sure will at least make some people go check out the website, see what they have going on, because you never know. I also wanted just a quick thank you to my friends over there at Amsterdam Tavern. We're going to be popping in for some shows coming up here. And if you are a soccer fan living in the city of St. Louis and you happen to like alcoholic beverages or even non-alcoholic beverages, head over to Amsterdam Tavern because you've got Champions League is winding down. Those games are getting really, really hot and interesting. You have a lot of qualifiers. You got league, especially in the EPL. This is the best part of the season for those of you that love the game. If you're a European soccer fan and especially of the Premier League, you all know what I'm talking about. We don't care about the top four. We care about the ones that might sneak into fourth or fifth. Getting into European play. It's way more fun watching the teams that are about to go the other way. And this is the part of the season where those games get hostile, and there is no better environment to watch these games than Amsterdam Tavern. Go in there, pick your kit, pick your team. Ironically, it's family friendly. You just send them out in the back. There's fences and stuff to toss a ball. Old school. It's South St. Louis. There are no rules. There's no suburban proper etiquette. Go have some fun. Go give them support. Check out the games. Now, without further ado, we are going to get into the experiences, the stories, the motivation behind an individual that is just neck deep, not knee deep, not waist deep, neck deep in the world of classic American professional soccer. Mr. Doug Cress, how's it going?
Great. Thanks for having me on the show, JB.
Yeah, man. I've been your page in particular. When we started this show, I really didn't know what direction I wanted to go, and you know, like everything else in life, social media matters. so, so I was kind of bouncing around. I knew who some of our guests were going to be early on, and within the St. Louis marketplace, we have a lot of those OGs that played in the MISL, that played in the NASL. And your page, 1970s Soccer USA, in particular, that's almost like that's a cheat sheet. That's the crib note. That's the cheat sheet. That's where if you want to see some of the greatest mullets ever in U.S. soccer, 1970 Soccer USA with over 28,000 followers. That's your baby. Let's start there. When did you start the page? Why did you start the page? What was the impetus?
Yeah, really. Again, thanks for having me on. I think those years of the NASL and the MISL are fascinating, and I was very much involved in those days, and in so many ways I still am. But soccer, which was an early part of my career, I played in college, and then I covered pro soccer as a reporter for the Washington Post and for the Los Angeles Daily News and Atlanta Constitution and Sports Illustrated. So I was always around it. I was very much there. Got my wife through the NASL. We met when she worked for Team America, and I was covering Team America in 1983 for the Post. So it was always around, but my career moved different directions, and I was working in environment and climate change and so forth, and working at the United Nations. And I was what this really happened, honest to God, in 2018, I was just facing one climate change report to write and edit too many. My brain was flattening out, and I could not face one more page of just gloom and doom, which is what a lot of climate change reports are at the UN level. Also very boring, or just turgid. And it just clicked in my head. 2018, I did the math. Hey, 50 years ago, the NASL started. And so just kind of, I don't even know why. I just posted a little thing saying, hey, 50 years ago, a really cool league popped up, and put it on Facebook because I didn't know anywhere else to go. I had no other social media in front of me in those days. And within seconds, it had like 100 likes. And I just didn't even know what to think about that. How did it find an audience so quickly? And so I put a couple more things out over the next day or two, and those got bigger responses. Then I started seeing some names that I knew, people who played, people who were officials or referees or whatever in the NASL. And I realized that there was this vein I had just crossed somehow accidentally that was waiting for something like this. And it really is, it's nothing more than a celebration of a really crazy, colorful, fun, mad, misbegotten, wildly entertaining 20 years or so, that between the NASL and the MISL, you just had a version of soccer in this country that we'll never see again. It's certainly nothing like what the MLS is now, but it was unbelievable. It was always up on two wheels, about to go over, but the ride was thrilling. And that's what the page is meant to celebrate. And, when you said 28,000 followers, it's going to go over 29,000 in about an hour, I think. Every one of those is organic. I mean, you can go and pay $100 and get 1 million out of Pakistan overnight.
Right.
These are all one by one as they find each other. And, in the early days, Pele was commenting on there, and Beckenbauer was commenting. And of course, a lot of these guys have passed away now, but he really seemed to find a home. And that's what's been fun about it.
So let me back the bus up just a little bit. You mentioned that you played as well in college. Give us an idea of the landscape. Where's home? What region? Where'd you play your college ball? Where did that love for the game percolate out of?
For me, really, for a good portion of my youth, I was living in Southern Africa. My stepfather was a education development person in developing nations, and so we were living in Southern Africa, and I was just mesmerized by these guys like Joe Mosono and Asen Salenge and all these guys who were South African stars that I kept noticing were showing up in Denver and Colorado and New York and places like that in this league. So I'm overseas, seeing pictures of them in magazines or newspapers in Johannesburg and places like that. And it just piqued my interest. And I played there and then came back to Washington, D.C., where we moved. And so suburban areas there. My college career was brief. I was at George Washington University. And by then I was already working at the Washington Post. And I couldn't balance both those things, and the Pope won. But it really, the DC was a real hotbed, like so many places are. Great sort of suburban Maryland, suburban Virginia, soccer growth, and it really just seemed to be on fire. And then you had an NASL team and the Diplomats that sort of fed that. They did. It was funny. Like so many teams, they couldn't get it right though. They would schedule their matches like on a Saturday afternoon when all the kids are out playing league games, or rec games. So they were battling an attendance number they couldn't quite solve because they were competing with exactly the people they wanted or needed. But that's where home was then, and ever since I've lived kind of everywhere.
So you mentioned the writing as well for a number of publications, including SI, et cetera. Was it? I'm assuming it was soccer coverage at that time primarily, or?
No, most of those places, you had to fight to get soccer in print, and in those. I started in 1979 at the Post, and you had to fight. Yeah, we had an NASL team, but with the exception of games and sort of advances and so forth, you really had to make a case for a reason. A World Cup was not an automatic thing to go cover. The U.S. wasn't going to be in it. It was definitely not on anybody's radar. I had made many, many, many treks into the sports editor's office and try and pitch a soccer story or pitch something. And, in those days, if you look at old clips, every soccer story is jokey. There's something about, there's some kind of a hook to it or a shtick that is meant to sell it to the average reader. The Post, like any other major publication, and this would certainly include Sports Illustrated, really very seldom gave an honest reading of what soccer was. It always had to have some kind of an angle. And, you're fighting against very established sports: baseball, hockey, basketball, football. Those really had the stranglehold. And,
it's funny. It's funny that you talk about it in that light, because we were lucky enough to have Clint Mathis on a little while back, and Sports Illustrated came up because in that World Cup year, it was the first time ever a U.S. soccer player adorned the cover, and it was because of that famous painted mohawk, right? And he clearly had a tremendous World Cup as well. And even to this day, it still feels as if the prowess or the popularity of the game, and mind you, publications to a degree, like radio, like terrestrial TV, they're all falling off. I mean, that's just kind of the reality of the situation. But breaking through still seems hard. And when I think back to the NASL league in particular, you're talking about Pele, you're talking about Beckenbauer, Cruyff, et cetera, these the greatest names to ever play the game. I think that's one of the problems that the league maybe had, because you're dealing in markets that those are not household names,
No.
and trying to come up with a kitschy story or something to get them hooked. Why do you think that is? Where do you think the disconnect was? Was it too many soccer guys trying to run a business and not enough business guys trying to run a soccer league?
No, that's actually a real. You would think that, and certainly the real brains behind it, Phil Woosnam and some of the others, were certainly soccer people, but they managed to get most of the major corporations in the United States and in North America into that league, whether it's Frito-Lay or Coca-Cola or Labatt's Breweries or Turner Broadcasting. These were not small-time Warner Brothers and Warner Communications. I mean, these are massive corporations that thought they were onto something.
Right.
I think the reality of what you have, though, is there just was nothing no shared experience to draw up from. So you're trying to come top down. And top down is great as long as you're signing George Best and Eusebio and Pele and everybody else. But that only goes so far. And that's why I think what you saw in those days, that was the first rebel league that really, you might say maybe the ABA, Basketball Association, maybe the World Hockey Association, but you started to get really crazy marketing concepts and team names and colors and so forth. And, if you think about it today, most of the player introductions before a game are directly inspired by MISL and NASL teams. That sense of razzle dazzle and, flames going up and explosions, that all came from those sports. So many of the innovations that the NASL and MISL, but more outdoor, brought on the game are now FIFA law. I mean, they slowly worked their way in, and FIFA kept saying, no, 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 no. And then suddenly it's a great idea. And This is just they were way ahead of their time.
It is a little bit of the Americanization of global sport in general. Case in point, I look at the Premier League over the past 10 years, 15 years in particular. The NFL has kind of been their model that they stare at. Monday Night Football is an institution here. It has been for 60, 70 years or 50 years plus, whatever. The Premier League rolled out, Monday Night Football not too long ago. Like everybody just thinks it's kind of normal. Well, it's not for them. So a lot of these global sports, soccer in particular, we're stealing the TV/production value that Americans are really, really good at. And here domestically, the NASL it couldn't figure out how to break through vertically, to the roots. Can you take a second to maybe just spitball, because it seems as if, given the last two U.S. men's national team games we've seen, we're still having issues with root/development/interest. Give me a quick compare contrast from the cheap seats after looking at the attendance in the stadium, the Panama and Canada game, to the quote golden generation that just got kicked in the teeth twice by two nations that we should absolutely be rolling over. Compare and contrast those for me.
Sure. I think what we have is now it's the 180-degree turn from the early 70s or the 70s and the 80s. We have an incredibly cultured and educated fan base which knows what matters and what doesn't. And on the weekend of March Madness, if you think you're going to go up against 64 NCAA basketball teams and draw big crowds, you're out of your mind. It just doesn't work that way. And they know they can go home and watch an EPL game or the Nations League games from Europe and get a pretty good quality product too. These games don't matter. We know it. That it's unfortunate we lost both of those games, but fans aren't going to run out and spend $50 to watch us, play patty cake with Panama. It's just not going to happen. The irony, of course, is you have this golden generation, as they're being called, which is shredding leagues in Europe right now, doing really, really well, unbelievably well, and not just like as goalkeepers as in the old days, but I mean major dynamic, game-changing players like Pulisic and the others. And when they come together, they're still missing that piece. Somehow that central pivot that it makes a team go, that leads a team, just hasn't emerged yet, or not again, perhaps. But we've never really had that player anyway. I mean, you can cite Landon Donovan or Tab Ramos or some others over the years.
Clint Dempsey.
Yeah, Clint Dempsey. But I mean, one who really holds the ball and decides how we're going to move forward down the field. Clint was more of a target man up front.
Yeah.
But still, there's just a lot to process there. We're also having to be judged on a global standard now. We got a pass for so many years because we sucked, and there was no sense that the U.S. was a danger or a threat, so no one really paid attention. But now we're being held to an international standard. These next two games coming up against Switzerland and Turkey are going to be interesting. If Pochettino's got any kind of mojo with these guys, it better start showing itself. I'm not quite as grumpy as Lexi Lawless seems to be. Lexi's like having a heart attack.
I had to snooze him for 30 days. He's grumpy. He's too grumpy. Let's jump back into the NASL, and I kind of want to get a feel for what your fans from the page, as you started to curate the content. Let's start there, because just to open up a page and say, hey, who's interested in NASL, ha ha ha, and then 200 likes later, you're like, holy shit, okay, the people are interested. What was the strategy early? Like, what did you think? Was it just about pictures? Like, oh, you remember this picture? Oh, look at that logo. Where were you in the early days and just putting the content out?
Well, in the early days, it was just on my personal Facebook page. I just posted something, and some of the old players are friends of mine. So, I mean, I wasn't too surprised that, let's say, Alan Merrick or some of these fellows who played in teams I covered might have responded. But then when I realized there was a bigger audience, I created a separate page. But you can tell how little strategy I had. I have the worst name ever, 1970s Soccer USA. What does that mean? But I was just trying to find any letters and numbers that would let me build a page. And so I had no thought. And I initially just thought, well, some pretty pictures, a few things I remember, usually something that came out of my own experiences with these guys in some way or uniform. And I was trying to hold it initially to a sort of journalistic standard, write well, only good pictures, only, something you haven't seen before. I realized that was foolish, because once I started seeing the crowd build, they just wanted a place to come to, a reason to talk to each other, a reason to feel the feelings again. And so it started to just blow up. And it's there's no strategy. I sometimes post 20, 30 times a day. That is, anybody will tell you that's suicide.
Are you curating at this point now? You're 6 years into the page roughly. Are you going into archives? Are you doing any kind of research to find the photos, to find the clips?
All the time.
Or how much of it is you outbound searching versus people saying, hey, Doug, check this out?
No, it's 50-50 now. And any given day, 20, 30 messages come in with attachments that are files of people from their own photos, their own backgrounds. A lot of times it's players who've gone back into their garage and found all their stuff and send me all these pictures from their days. What I really think are the most fun are ones when it's off the beaten path pictures, when they're goofing around the locker room or on a plane or something like that, or they have reunions. That's a big one. Whenever there's a reunion of players, they all send in photos because they like to share the experience. And to them, it's nice to be remembered. And I think that's something this page does for a lot of these people. They feel perhaps forgotten, or as if time passed their era by. But I think we wouldn't have an MLS if there wasn't NASL and to some degree the MISL. A lot of those markets wouldn't have been developed if NASL hadn't been there first. You can. There's a huge amount that and just in terms of broader American sports over the NASL, they got to Tampa long before anybody else, and they opened that city up, and it's massive now, as is. Name your Tulsas and so forth. Seattle, the whole Pacific Northwest really didn't exist on anybody's sporting radar until the NASL got out there.
So let's talk about NASL and the kind of the player breakdown early in the league. It's really, really famous for catching all those guys in their twilight, the bottom of the ninth, right? That were the world's best. And the league implemented super minimal rules pertaining to the number of American players on a roster or on the field. And simply put, there were not a lot of American players on the field for the vast majority of the games. In your experience, kind of living, looking at it through today's lens, because obviously national pride and the issues in college soccer with foreign players, which has really always been an issue or present in college soccer, but it's coming to the forefront. It's in a lot of those conversations. When you look back at the NASL and the way that it handled the American player integration, do you think they did it? Did they get it right? Did they get it wrong? Because if you only have to have 2 or 3 players on the field at a time, is U.S. soccer benefiting, in the long run when you have such a low head count? Talk a little bit about that, the demo of the league, and whether or not that was, in your opinion, smart, an advantage, a disadvantage to soccer overall over the long run.
I think they were trying. I think they did the best they could with what they had. There just weren't very many very good American players in those days. And if you had the sort of flip of the rules as Europe had, say in the 80s and 90s, where you had a limit of maybe 3 foreigners on the field at any given time, and most teams would sign 4, and that would be it. So if you're in Italy or in Spain, that's going to be your cap. It would never have worked. We would have had some of the worst soccer known to mankind because Americans just weren't up to that level yet. They also weren't a draw. They were never going to be, there weren't enough to be superstars where you could fill seats and so forth. If Pele runs out on the field, you got 25,000 people. If he's not there, you don't have that number. And that's the reality of it. But they had a number of things. They were also doing the thing that no other league in the world was doing, which was all of that youth outreach. They were doing camps and clinics every single day of their lives. And so they were building up a fan base as fast as they could with American players primarily. And as they were trying to raise up the level of sort of, NASL class American players. But It was tricky. You had to have, the most that were maxed out at was 4 North Americans on the field, but you could have green card players. So a guy like Giorgio Canaglia, who played for Italy in the World Cup and is the all-time leading scorer for the NASL, he counts as an American because he has a green card. When I was covering Team America, the joke was that half those players weren't even American citizens yet. Now, they had to all have been in the process of applying. Some kind of let it fade and didn't follow through. Some did. But there just weren't enough Americans, even in 1983. And this is, 10 years on from the start of the league, essentially. And there just weren't enough. But it's also exposure and it's credibility. They battled to get a TV contract that was useful. It didn't really work out. TV didn't cover soccer very well. It broke for commercials. I mean, that's just madness. Everything about that was they were running uphill or into a brick wall, one or the other, all the time. And I think, when you look back on it, that they survived as long as they did, it's fairly miraculous.
So that's a great transition because U.S. soccer during those years, unfortunately, the league it showed cracks in the armor, chinks in the armor early on, and it kind of accelerated, in short order. That transitional period there in the late 70s gave birth really to the MISL, the indoor league. Talk about your own experience, kind of, reading the tea leaves as that's all playing out. You go from the world's game with the world's greatest ever on a full field 11-11, trying to get 15, 20, 25, 30,000 people to a stadium, to this new concept of, no, let's not do that. Let's go indoors. Let's put walls up. Let's make it, 5v5 and goalies, and let's make it fast and crazy and DJs, and let's make it American style. Number one, why do you think indoor was the next iteration? And number two, why do you think it thrived in those early years in the majority of the cities that it was located?
Yeah, MISL did not make too many bad choices. There's a few real howlers there, but you live in a perfect example of a city. The St. Louis Stars, for all the years that they competed in the NSL, battled to play at a major league stadium, battled to draw decent crowds, battled to get any kind of visibility, and they had some of the best American players possible. You had Al Trost and Pat McBride and so forth. I mean, you had the best there was going to be. That was a living, breathing example of what Americans can do. And yet they were never really a threat. And the team, when it kind of quietly went away after 1977 out to California, you had a void. And then the St. Louis Steamers came along, and they proved that you could do the same thing with Americans if you play a game that Americans get. And something about indoor soccer, the way we do it, the way we did it, is just it's madness. I mean, it's crazy that they never tried to play along with FIFA. They were never a FIFA recognized league, so that didn't matter to them. That they can make up their own rules as they went along. They stuck to a kind of a model of mostly Middle America, which was really looking for indoor winter sports. And your needs are less. You don't need 25, 30,000 people because arenas hold 15, 16, in those days. And it just worked. It was slam bang, fast, crazy. It didn't do soccer itself much good, unfortunately. It didn't develop players in the way you'd like. And anytime an MISL guy came to the national team in those days, you could see this sort of lack of game fitness. It just wasn't there. And they would talk about it. Rick Davis and others will say that there was no way to prepare for World Cup qualifiers. But, Americans, as much as they sort of were slow to understand soccer and resist and were having to be sort of, the media was really not quite clear on how to sell this. When they saw something that was uniquely theirs, like indoor soccer, they could get the joke, as it were, and just went with it. And suddenly it took off. And, all these things, though, come down to dollars and cents in the end and market competition. But for a period of time there, they were outdrawing the NHL, the NBA in those major cities, Cleveland, St. Louis, Kansas City, chase teams out of town. I mean, it was amazing.
Yeah, we were lucky enough to have the Mad Hatter himself on early, Mr. Don Ebert, and when he talked about that transition, because obviously his story's fairly famous in so much that he was supposed to go to New York, right, and got up there and was like, nope. and was out of there. He gave up the 11-11 with these legends, and he consciously chose to go indoor. At a time in which and he expressed to us like his passion was 11-11, wanted national team and wanted to be pro. MISL was the option, and to your point, these Midwest kind of Rust Belt cities, the game thrived there because the time frame. Look, this is Carter years. You're coming out of a oil embargo. There's all these towns that are struggling, and indoor soccer was this just like I remember sitting in the upper in the rafters. It was a rock and roll show every night.
Yeah, it was. And look, someone like Don's a great example. In choosing to leave the Cosmos, I mean, he spent half a season with them roughly, and it got no playing time. But in doing that, he also gave up his international career. I mean, everything went away for him. But that's not what most players, where they think, sure, not nowadays. And then in those days, the Olympic team and national team had a little more cachet to it in some weird ways. But no, he gave up everything for that. And you were stepping into it, just a big, bright, shiny, crazy world with MISL. And there was no shortage of gimmicks. And you had some of the smartest people running those teams. The Wiki brothers, who to this day are major sports moguls. They knew what they were doing in Kansas City and places like that. And you had teams actually turning profits in Cleveland and St. Louis. And it's quite amazing what for a brief period really just flamed up.
See, Stan Musial, the owner here in St. Louis at the MISL, he wasn't really in the game of like creating a mogul business, because he would just take all the guys to Stan's bar afterward. That's the stuff that's like the stories that are just legendary. Speak to that a little bit, because that's such a unique time in U.S. history in general, sporting history. Talk about that vibe. Again, it's not so much like I joked about the mullets earlier, but there was a grit. There was a kind of like a brand that was associated with the players that were not only in the NASL, the domestic players, but transferring into the MISL. And I've always thought about that era, because when you think of German soccer, you have a prototypical player. You have a brand. When you think of Brazilians, you're thinking of flair. When you think of the British, you think of choking. But when you think of American players, this idea of athletes and gritty, talk about like those years and the players that did thrive. Those were the kind of players, were they not? Why do you think that is? Where were we on the player profile map?
Profile map was developing, and it was shifting. Early on, okay, they used their hands, make them play goalkeeper. If we get a good international goalkeeper, we put them on the bench. But otherwise, we might survive with them. And then you kind of move up the field, as it were, or down the field. Maybe they can play a little defensive because they're big and they can knock you down and so forth. It was very condescending. It was very patronizing, the way that soccer was developed in this country, mostly by foreigners. Very few had flair, and very few had the ability to show their flair. Even somebody like Ricky Davis, who was a star in both leagues and certainly was for a period of time the most recognizable American player, got zero interest from overseas to ever play anywhere else. And in the teams he was on, particularly the Cosmos, he played a certain role with them, but he was never the breakout star, never going to be the person they built a team around, and probably was not one that they sold tickets for. He was just a very good American player. And that's, in those days, of course, all players had to go through college. They weren't coming through as prodigies at 17. They were fully formed 21-year-olds who knew a certain style. And it's just very hard to sort of break that up. But what you did find was we as Americans, North Americans with those leagues, began to really upset the rest of the world, because we were paying pretty good salaries for loans and so forth. And players didn't want to go back, especially to England and Scotland, so much so that they instituted a rule, no more loans to North America around 1981, I believe it was, because it was upsetting the balance of pay in the English leagues and the Scottish leagues. Players were dissatisfied. They didn't want to come back and spend 9 months kind of plowing through mud, when 3 months over here in sunshine got you far more money. So you start seeing players coming and staying.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to go home anymore. And that really began to rankle people. So the North American leagues, both of them, had a lot to overcome based on their own kind of weird success and weird take on the game.
Yeah, New York City and Chicago are a little bit different than Southampton in the wintertime.
Yeah, and that's one thing to remember too. You when you talk about any of these things, you can take the Cosmos and put them in a whole different category just because their model was really what, say, Real Madrid is nowadays, Galacticos and so forth. They were taking on a different. They wanted the world. They were touring every offseason. They played more games on tour than they ever played in league play, creating their own international tournaments just to get a higher quality, a higher caliber of opponent in. Nobody else was able to keep up with that, and it wasn't a dollars race in the same way. It was a visibility race and a marketing race.
Yeah, Larry Holzer talked about that a little bit on one of the tours because he was part of the team with Pele that they did the Brazilian tour. And growing up here in St. Louis, you think of like your youth sports icons, from the 50s, 60s Cardinals, et cetera, and talking about the difference, unless you were there and saw it, you just didn't understand it because it's just the scale of the game. I would be remiss if I didn't, force you to talk about geography and cities, because obviously America is still finding its footing when it comes to soccer culture, soccer traditions, etc. And I want to get your take, kind of, extrapolating out from these teams and the cities, maybe that these teams were primarily focused in, but then expanding out into the player pools. St. Louis is, that's our alma mater here. We were a pipeline, have been and continue to be a pipeline to all levels of the game. When you look back at NASL and MISL in particular, can you speak to, maybe the cities that were getting it right versus, cities that maybe thought they were a soccer market that it just, that either it wasn't embedded in the fandom or the culture or the community, but more importantly, the players, the player pools. Can you talk about, comparing cities a little bit and then maybe taking a second and giving me your own opinion and insight on what, the St. Louis player and its role in these leagues?
All right. Well, let me take it back to front. Your St. Louis question is a great one to kind of tease out, because I would say St. Louis and the greater St. Louis area is different than most because it had a tradition already. That 1950 World Cup team was drawn from St. Louis. You guys already were an established hotbed, and so it's kind of ironic that you struggled so much in that city to get a professional team to really click. It's as if you already had so much else out there with youth leagues and college and everything else, that there was just, in club teams, you had fantastic club teams. So putting one more layer on top was like a cherry nobody really was looking for. You didn't feel like you had to have it. And as a result, the Stars suffered, and the Steamers did get it right, but just in a little different way. But you already had it. So by the time the NASL came around, it seemed like a logical thing. The Pacific Northwest out here where I live, particularly Seattle, Vancouver, and Portland, that didn't exist. There was nothing. There was no sense of a soccer community or world when those teams came in 74, 75, but very quickly began to build out from that. And as a result, those three teams to this day are still called the same teams that they were in the NASL, still drawing on people who and traditions, and even the same stadiums that were being used in the NASL in two cases. And the line is very clear that what started back then in the 70s is still thriving today because of what they did. They really had to fight and build up the community, build up the youth programs, build up the coaching, build up that sense of where it fits in the media market. And as you'll notice, not like we have a whole lot of other professional sports in Seattle or in Portland and Vancouver either. So these teams really do have a lion's share of the visibility.
Let me interrupt and ask kind of a follow-up question along those lines, because if we do kind of dissect this a little bit, one of the reasons St. Louis was an early entry into the game was really kind of its demographic breakdown, the immigrants that came here. You talk about that 1950 team. Uh, its spine came from the Italian community on the hill right here in South St. Louis. We had a huge German population. We had a lot of Irish, et cetera. We had kind of an expanded Catholic league, the CYC, in which all of these parishes, these families are of European descent, and they knew the game. They already knew the game and kind of brought it into these communities, and it grew from there. What was it in Seattle and Portland and Vancouver, that even though you were late entrants into the mix in the mid-70s, what was there that helped make it stick? Were there kind of cultural pockets that were already soccer fans just waiting for it? Or was it just kind of this maybe this cultural, advanced culturalism in which they wanted to take on this more Euro game or global game as opposed to the NFL or the MLB?
Out here, it is very, very Anglo-Saxon. That's exactly what they got, was a very British product that came over, and all three teams reflected a very British mindset. The management was English or British. The coaches, the styles, and you got that sort of just drummed into the fan base up here. So that's what they recognized. That's what they came to appreciate. And again, still many of those coaches and so forth are still sitting out here working, or they're in retirement. But I don't care, or have passed away. But I don't care whether it's Bill Irwin or Clive Charles or Alan Hinton or Tony Waiters or John Best or any of those people who built these teams, Bob Leonard Doozy. They all had an English pedophile. Whoops, I don't mean pedophile. Profile to them. Sorry about that.
It's crazy days. Don't worry about it.
It is. If you can clip that one out, I'd appreciate it. But they all came from a very, very English mindset. And then the weather's like that. It rains all the time. You're playing in mud.
Yeah, you were talking about that. I'm like, oh my God, this is just basically London West with more trees.
Yeah. Harry Redknapp and Bobby Howe and Jimmy Gabriel and all those guys. This is what they recognized. And Clyde Best and others, just standing ankle deep in mud is exactly how they were playing back in West Ham and everywhere else. And this is perfectly normal to them. And it's funny how you'd watch in those early days of the NASL. It was almost childlike in the way they tried to build teams. Let's say the team in Chicago, the Chicago Sting, they would likely sign German and Polish players because that's what you thought you had as an ethnic community.
It's what the Fire did.
Well, it's sure. And if you're down in Miami, you're going to get a lot of Latin players. And if you're, it's just funny how you do, like, for some reason Atlanta went all South African players, and so they had a huge number of them. It's just funny how that they were taking sort of the low hanging fruit mentality, because that's all they could think to do in those days. And
well, okay, so you just kind of teed it up. I'm going to take a low hanging fruit question here at coming out of those statements. We alluded to, we talked about a little bit of the U.S. national team's own hiccups here lately, and then I talked about kind of that German profile, the Brazilian profile, or Dutch profile, et cetera, right? When you think of U.S. soccer, and, along the lines of what we're talking about, where you go into these regions and you have these clear-cut demographics and these mentalities and playing styles that are emanating from those coaches and trainers that descend from England, from, CONCACAF, anywhere within CONCACAF. How big of an issue is that, if we're really being honest with ourselves, when we zoom out a little bit and just objectively look at our national team pool and we look at our brand? Because we get into this debate all the time. It's the whole Beatles versus Stones thing. What's our style? Given the lens and your experience and your brain and how it relates to these old leagues and these demo influences, grade where we are now. What are we? What is our style? What is our brand? What is our image as a U.S. national team?
Yeah, we don't have one right now, and I'd give us a solid C, and it may be trending downward, but it is still the melting pot, except that everybody is a melting pot now. Used to be in the old days, you could look at any player and probably guess what country they played for. And now with immigration and with so much mobility around the world, you can't. It's just impossible. So we're in the same boat as the rest of the world. Some have just gotten it a little righter than we have. We missed the boat a couple of times, big time in this country. We didn't give any real credibility or development to Latin players, and we didn't give any real credibility or development to Black players. And but by both of those being left to the side, especially in the 80s and early 90s, it's criminal, and we cost ourselves as a result. So we sort of trying to tack them on later and add little bits and pieces, but it wasn't what you call a harmonious mix. It wasn't anything that represented what America might be as athletes and as soccer players. And we do have a Latin coach now in Pochettino, but up till now we really haven't. We haven't had all the coaches out there, the Hugo Perez's and Todd Ramos's and others who should have had a shot at the national team by now. They weren't going to get it. There used to be a rule. It was unspoken, but it was a rule that they wouldn't let Chico Borja play on at the same time as Hugo Perez because there'd be two Latin guys on the national team, and they didn't want that to dominate the midfield. So if one got called up, the other one wouldn't, or vice versa. I mean, it was, and they talk about it. Both those two would talk about it all the time. They knew exactly what that deal was, and that's just so myopic and so short-sighted. Unfortunately, we're in a time now where that sense of blending and immigration and that sense of I don't know, a quilt, a mulligan stew, whatever you want to call it, becomes more and more sort of dangerous. People are being told it's dangerous. And so we may be even going further away from what our real calling should be. I don't see a style right now. I don't see anything that looks like what these men can do in so many top leagues. I don't care whether it's the Netherlands or Spain or Italy or the UK. They play like world beaters. I see them all the time. They come together that they couldn't possibly get out of a Sunday Park league. And there's just something there that doesn't click.
I think it was Sasha Kleiston the other day, maybe yesterday on Twitter, I believe it was, had a tweet that went out where he said, this, and I'll paraphrase it, you can be as technical as you want to be, but when you play on the national team, you got to be as gritty as you got to have as much grit as possible, however you put it. And you watch this team, and on paper, right? If we're to, somebody hands me the playbill and each page is the player profile, and you look at, where they come from, what team are they at, what's their stats, what, on paper, and even the old guard, they admit they didn't play on those teams. They were not playing in Champions League. They were not, battling for top 4 in the Premier League. None of that was an option for them. Almost our whole roster, at least the top 20, they're experiencing that in real time, but it's not equating out. And
no.
So when you look at that, grit, who do you like? Who do you think within this pool is kind of going to be that Rudy? That's who's going to motivate? Because there was another video that just was dropped a little while back. It was Pulisic, kind of in a golf cart of all things, admitting he's like, man, some days I don't know if I'm competitive enough, and I'm trying. I got to figure this out. And Thierry Henry watched the video and on the panel was like, if you don't got it, you don't got it.
Yeah. It's funny. Pulisic has been the poster child for the pressure and the mental games for 8-10 years now, it seems like. I mean, there was a whole commercial campaign with him at the last World Cup, which I thought was bizarre. It sort of allows a weakness it gives a name to a weakness or to a fear or to a lack of or anxiety that may not be the best foot you want to put forward. But I was going to say also, ironically, all of these players you're talking about are playing in really rough physical leagues. If you think you have more than a second and a half on the ball in the English Premier League, you're crazy, Yep. And they're getting moved off the ball very fast, and they're getting dumped. Serie A has never been called a soft league, and they're getting serious knocks. So it's not that they don't have grip sometimes; it's just somehow the context of where they're playing in Europe is different. It's going to come down to players like Pulisic, though. He's going to have to find something inside that says, I'm a leader. And if you're not a leader, because the only leader I ever see is still Tim Ream. And he doesn't play enough now, but he's the only guy who's out there. I'm going, okay, at least central defense is organized. I know he knows what this should look like. And I don't see that with a lot of other players.
Yeah, that's a really hard one for us because he's our boy, right? He's a backyard.
Yeah.
He's a backyarder. And at that age, it's like you're rooting for him hard. Just stay healthy because, he is composed, and at the CB role, that's what you need.
Yeah.
I want to run something past you and just get your take on it along the lines of what we're talking about. A little while back, we were having a conversation with Brad Davis, and Brad, in fact, it was after, I think it was the Gold Cup loss. We had an emergency episode, and Brad came on, and he had the goods, he had the data, and he talked about the 2014 team, and he said, here's the thing, our 2014 team that went as far as we did. He goes, on that roster, 16 of us were either the captains or the default leaders on each of our individual teams. And on that team in the Gold Cup that just lost, fast forward to now, of that roster, you have less than 4, I think is the number, that are captains on the teams that they play on. And it's that leadership. When you hear that, does that scare you? Does that maybe inspire you? Because it's like, okay, that we know what we're missing now. We need more captains.
Yeah. But this is something that Pochettino's going to have to figure out. And he's got to sort of build up some captain or captains that really have that presence, both on the field and in the training room. I don't think you'll see Ream playing a whole lot, but I bet you he's on a World Cup team because he's going to be a really helpful player in the training room and in training and that kind of stuff. We're struggling at goalkeeper, and that's ironic because that used to be our strength, and we don't have anybody who's getting first division, first team minutes anymore at that level. So that's really hurting us. And I think that communication builds out. So the defense is always a little disjointed, not quite sure where we stand. And that's usually where you find a lot of your captains, or at least when you get up to maybe center, the center of the attack. But it's not the crazy flighty, forwards. They're too eccentric for that kind of stuff. It's going to be the guys who sit in deep and see the game develop and understand where it's going to go. And it's there's just not a natural. I mean, maybe Robinson is one of the guys who you think, okay, he's kind of playing out there on the left. What can he, if he's healthy, can he move in a little more for us, or can he take on that role? Because he does a great job with Fulham. I mean, he seems to be as in control and as sort of measured as you could be. And it's unfortunate he didn't play recently, but
or you need that little bulldog like an Adams who's just going to smash everything. An inspirational leader, so to speak,
Yeah.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about, I want to do kind of a breakdown, compare, contrast of your passion, that being the NASL, MISL, NASL in particular for the point of this next segment. MLS, we're up to 30 teams? 30,
yeah,
30.
They're on a roll. Yeah.
30 teams. Soccer-specific stadiums galore. Your attendance numbers are going up. There's the Messi effect. There's the Apple TV. And I always talk about like my anecdotal metric that proves to me that the game is growing faster than anybody wants to admit it is when you go to pick up your kids at school and you look at all the kids running around. And here in St. Louis, right, we're in Cardinal Nation. There's no Cardinal jerseys. They're all wearing Man U, Liverpool, City. Yep. Talk about MLS. Just give it. If somebody from abroad were to say, "Hey, Doug, I hear you guys have a pro league. Tell me about it." What are some of the highlights that you like about what the league is doing right now?
Look, it's managed to be faithful to its model, which is, a single entity where everybody is staying within the borders. Everybody is sharing information, sharing revenues, and so forth. They are building the stadiums they need. Those early days when you'd have the upper decks, screened off. I mean, it was embarrassing. It was. The Seattle still does it, blows my mind, although they make it work. But it was not a good advertisement. They're not playing on AstroTurf like the old days with football lines all over the place. And look, they've got a soccer product now that you can be proud of. They've got a stable league with tremendous growth, and Commissioner Garber has done wonderful stuff in building that league and set a model for how you can do this. But don't forget, the MLS came along right after the Japanese league started and blew up, and the Japanese league was going to be the new model, same sort of thing. You don't hear a word about the Japanese league anymore, and it barely exists, even though for a minute there they plundered everybody and brought all the foreign stars they could and foreign coaches, and it just didn't take. This has done it patiently and building up, and the franchise fees are unbelievable, and it has zero excitement. That's the part that blows my mind. It has zero excitement in, I would say, 29 out of 30 markets, the 30th being Miami, where they did, just like you would expect. They went out and signed superstars, and there's a buzz, and everybody's excited. And if you're picking up your kids at school, if you're seeing jerseys, you're seeing some pink ones too, I'm sure.
All day.
Because Messi is, those jerseys are everywhere. I see them all over the world when I travel. Inter Miami jerseys are everywhere now. And to me, that single entity model was important to build, but you've got to throw it away now or add a second level to it and let teams go out and spend, because you're going to have the results you get in Chicago or St. Louis or wherever else if you're stuck at trying to convince somebody that you just got a designated player. If you have to convince people that this guy's a designated player, he's worth a DP, then you don't have him. No one had to be convinced about Messi or Suarez or anybody else like that.
Oh, okay. So let's talk a little bit about that enthusiasm and the excitement that you were kind of alluded to, where the MLS seems to be like it's just off of the target.
Yeah.
Just last week, big news out of the USL camp with the Pro Rel introduction of Pro Rel from what will be their D1 league through the championship and USL 1. I've mentioned on this show that when that did come out, I was astounded by the fandom that was like excited for it. I knew people who were going to be like, "Oh, that's cool. That that's going to be interesting." I don't even think the people at USL understood how much true soccer nerds were like, "Oh my God, this is our holy grail." When you look at, we are now going to be one of the only countries in the world where you're going to have two competing Division I leagues. MLS clearly has the vast majority of the big money buyers. It has the Messi effect. It has the stadiums, etc. But take a second and speak to USL and what they're doing in those markets and those 12 to 15,000 seat soccer specific stadiums. What do you like over there that they're doing that is maybe more organic or appealing compared to what MLS is doing?
Yeah, just because you get a Division I designation doesn't mean you're Division I, and I don't think anybody's going to be fooled by that. I appreciate USL, and I think what they did was put the cards out so we all know who's who now. Okay, we understand. Yeah, so everybody has to take their positions. But what I think is different now is a lot of American owners, and don't forget, not every team in the United States is owned by Americans. Just like every team in the world is not owned by Italians or Englishmen or so forth. I think there's a growing appreciation, understanding of what relegation and promotion is. And I don't think you'll see what I'm getting to is I think you'll see MLS adopt relegation and promotion fairly quickly. I would say in the next 5 to 10 years, it'll be not even a question, because the owners are comfortable. They understand it. If you're going to go buy Southampton or Birmingham or Wrexham, you're wanting to go up. You understand what that means. It's exciting. It's so, you're willing to take the smaller bet. If you're up there already, you want to stay up. It's the fight, There's just an added sense of energy to it. If you look at the NBA right now and watch these teams, and I live in a city with one of them, where they have organically and scientifically figured out a way to tank year after year after year to try and win the draft. Philadelphia and Oklahoma City and so many others where there's no way to get me excited about that. And if they were going to be sent down and a G League team was coming up, boy, you'd see a little different action out there on the court. You wouldn't see players shut down so quickly and load management and that kind of crap. It's I covered the.
That's it. That's it. No, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I mean, I just had this ding, ding, ding moment. Like, if the majority of our players on the national team level have been coming up through systems or academies that are byproducts of the MLS organizations, right? If there's not a mindset that losing doesn't really cost you that much, right?
Yeah.
Well, can is that one of maybe the obvious things that like our players don't understand? How imperative it is to win, because if you sign your 4+1 deal and you go to RSL and you get your minutes and get your deal and you get the points, maybe you get a bonus, but if you don't get your points, you're still on your base. And if you finish in last place, no harm, no foul. Come back next spring.
Yeah, if you're talking about how that plays out across the national team, no, because every one of our national team players lives in the relegation promotion world, and
True.
so they, this is
Well, but
ingrained.
I'm talking about the bigger pool though, because we
Yeah,
talked about all of our European players. They're not captains on their teams, right? It goes
yeah,
back to the Brad conversation.
sure.
Now we could theoretically see way more American players as leaders, as captains within MLS quicker than we would see them over in Europe doing the same thing. And if that was there, now you're tasked with something. Everybody wants to win their division. Everybody wants to make the playoffs. And yeah, I'd love to lift the cup. But if your real job was, hey, don't fuck up, we can't go down, right?
Yeah,
That would be cool as hell.
I agree, and I think it used to be an American ethic was we have to win. We only like winners, win at all costs, win or go home, that kind of stuff. I mean, I was raised that way. To me, nothing is worse than finishing second. I
Right.
hate it. I mean, it's in my DNA. Maybe that has changed over the time. Maybe this is a whole millennial, Gen Z, Gen X byproduct. That's I'm well older than any of that, so I don't know. But it certainly there doesn't seem to be an urgency to excel and to take it on yourself. I don't see a lot of that. Like, I was of the mindset when I played, and certainly when I grew up, that okay, you're going to go through me. Then I'm going to stand here, and we're going to stop this right now. And
Yep.
that taking responsibility maybe is not there in the same way. I'm really out of my comfort zone here in terms of psychotherapy for teenagers.
No. That's the whole point of this show. We are supposed to be cheap.
Just make it up.
Cheap therapy for U.S. soccer fans. That's our tagline. Hey, I'm going to roll us out of here. I've taken up a lot of your time here, and I really do appreciate it. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask you. Desert Island. I'm going to give you 3. Take your 3 favorite soccer, NASL or MISL players from St. Louis to go on that desert island with you to bring some T-Ravs and Budweisers. Who are you wanting to hang out with?
I love Dave Burchick. I mean, he's always been, I covered him with the Lasers for a long time and just is a great guy. Steve Petcher for sure. And I love Carl Rose too. So I think those 3 right there would be 3 locals for me.
3 of my favorites. Can't lose there. Doug Cress, thank you so much for joining me, man. Appreciate it. I'll have a link to the Facebook page in the show notes for those of you that are listening if you want to go check it out. Super cool, very nostalgic, just some tips and tricks and data that you didn't even know about from our beloved game. But thank you very much for your time, Doug.
Great. Thanks for having me.